Hello everyone. I welcome you to the lecture which is part of the course Writing from the Margin. And today's lecture is titled Understanding Tribal History. Now first in this lecture we will look at the idea of history, the word tribal, all the things that are associated, all the ideas which are associated with this term tribal, how it acquired various synonyms across time, and also what does the idea of history, or how does the idea of history relate to this term, right? So that's going to be the crux of our discussion in this lecture. If we look at the term tribals, we see that tribals all over the world are called by different names, right? Such as primitives, indigenous, aboriginal, natives, among others. So in various parts of the world, different terms are used to refer to this section of society. And that's what I just a while ago said, that we're going to look at these terms, the term tribal and its, so to say, usages in different parts. Now, closer home, if we talk about India, we see that how tribals live in different regions. They have different cultures and languages, right? As we all are aware that each social section in that sense has its own distinct culture, and which then is articulated through their literature, through their interactions, through various forms of expressions that emerge from that section of society, right? But of course, as we all are aware, that there appears to be some kind of bias a lot of times in the social setup, where the voices or the experiences of a certain social section remain muted as compared to certain other sections, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind. And when we talk of tribals, this is, this point becomes very, very relevant. And therefore, the entire idea of marginality then, which, comes to be associated with the tribals and their experiences. So why do we call, or why are we referring to the term marginality? Because their presence then in social, cultural, political, and economic sphere, in a lot of times remains marginal. Now, and why does that happen? Why is it that certain social sections, do not find a place in the mainstream, but instead, continue to be on the margins? Or why this kind of last line? So we need to see that, in a social setup, why is it that a certain section of society continues to remain on the margins, and it does not make its way into the mainstream? So these are some of the questions that kind of come to mind when we consider the tribal experience, right? So far we have looked at 2 points. A, that how tribals all over the world are called by different names. In India also we have tribals in different regions. All of them have their own culture, their own languages, etc. And then we say that they represent a particular section of society which has, as history has it, has been on the margins. And this is something that we are supposed to question, right? That why does a social section then is relegated to the margins, or what is it that kind of prevented certain social sections from coming into the mainstream, right? Now, moving on, we also look at the term the Adivasis. Now, this is another term which is a lot of times used to refer to the tribals. Now, what does it mean? Of course, we are talking about it in the Indian context. Now, the term Adivasis means the first settlers. So it is actually believed that their history goes back to prehistoric times. Due to the lack of written information, then, of course, it is difficult to chronicle the past of the tribals, and with this, of course, we also enter into the domain of history. But the term Adivasis then, which means first settlers. So the term first is very, very important, and this makes us aware of the fact that how history then of the tribals actually does go back to prehistoric times. Now, when I say prehistoric times, what do we mean by that? It means that during the time when there were no sophisticated means. So it is believed that the tribal's history goes back to prehistoric times. Right now, one might wonder that what do we mean by that? We mean that we are referring to that part of so to say, or that time period where there was lack of written information. So there were no resources to document certain experiences or document certain information, right? And therefore, the entire question or the difficulty of chronicling a certain past as well, right? So one thing that we very clearly notice is that their history then is is a long one, and the challenge over there that remains is the lack of written information, right? So these two aspects is something, are something that we need to keep in mind when we are engaging with the question of the tribals, right? So while we have looked at different terms, different phrases which talk about the tribal experience, but we have also then seen that how connected or in those terms such as Adivasis is also the idea of history, which then tells us that how the tribal history was prehistoric, goes back to the prehistoric times, and therefore the entire question of the lack of written information in most cases. Now, from here, we go on to say that one can also say that tribal history, therefore, is dependent upon the mainstream history. Now, we're of course talking about two very important terms here, tribal history and mainstream history. Now, what is mainstream history? If you remember at the beginning of the lecture, I talked about that how certain social sections occupy the margins while certain others are part of the mainstream. So when we say mainstream, it means that they have visibility. There are texts and various sources in the cultural and the political sphere that do talk about that social section. This section has representation in these various spheres. So something which is available for everyone to see, consume, and understand and interpret becomes then part of the mainstream, while that which formulates or which constitutes the margins is that which does not really find mention, does not find even sanction in that sense, in a lot of spheres, then continues to be part of the margins. So therefore, when we talk about the mainstream history, then it refers to that history which kind of pertains to that social section which has enjoyed some kind of a presence, visibility, legitimacy, etc. So therefore, we need to understand the idea of tribal history vis-a-vis mainstream history, and with respect to that, we say that tribal history is dependent upon mainstream history. Now, the word dependent, of course, is a very strong one. But what we mean by this is that, there are a lot of times we have noticed that that there's reference to, or there are references to the tribal experience in the mainstream narratives. Okay, and when we talk about this aspect, the reference of tribal experience in the mainstream narratives, this immediately brings to mind the ideas of appropriation, the ideas of misrepresentation, the idea of also a lot of times silencing. Now, we've used these three terms: misrepresentation, appropriation, and silencing. What do we mean by that? Now, we have noticed that the manner in which the tribals are then represented in the mainstream brings up these issues, that how a lot of times they are misrepresented. So their reality then goes through these filters of the mainstream understanding. So and what is the mainstream understanding? That is, the tribals are from the margins, right? So this then leads to some kind of a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of this group of people. Another term that we've used is silencing. We also see that a lot of times in the mainstream history or mainstream narratives, there would just be maybe at best a tangential presence of our tribal people. So which means what? You will not see narratives particularly devoted to discussing their experience at length. It would at best, as we just say, be tangential. So this of course then contributes to a silencing of an experience which otherwise is incredibly rich. So therefore we notice that while there have been while there are no kind of written documents, or while there's a dearth of a written history in that sense of the tribals, a lot of times we see that that a tribal history then depends on the mainstream history, and when their history is represented in the mainstream, there the question of a misrepresentation, silencing, and appropriation raise head. Right? Now, having said that, it's also over here very, very important to note that the narratives or the writings that now surface from the tribals become the alternate versions of history. So their narratives then set to confront all these biases, prejudices that one may note in the mainstream history regarding the tribals, right? So this version of the mainstream history and the alternate one, which now or which has been in the recent past surfacing in the form of narratives from the tribals, both of them need to be looked at in conjunction. Now, if we go back to the references of the tribals in the mainstream narratives, we see that there are references to them in different texts at different points of time. The Ramayana, has the character of Shabri. Mahabharata has the character of Eklavya, who is a Bhil boy and who learned archery from Dronacharya and offered his thumb as dakshina. We also see that in various other texts or various other mainstream narratives, a lot of times tribals are described as dasyus, ahirs, etc. So we see that while there are or there have been references to the social section in mainstream writings, history, and literature, but again, while looking at this fact, we cannot, forget the idea of silencing, prejudice, misrepresentation, appropriation with respect to their experience. And also, we need to keep in mind that how eventually then the tribal narratives served to create a history alternate to this perspective. Now, moving on, we see that how during the colonial period as well, the tribals had a presence and tribals were referred to with a particular kind of term. So the colonial narratives we notice of the 19th and the 20th century mention the tribals, and at that time the term was used for people living in the forests. And we also see that at that time, the administrators and anthropologists engaged in studying tribes. They made observations about this social section. And we have had some, very seminal writers from that time who have studied, this section of society. So colonists like J.P. Mills, G.H. Hutton, E.T. Dalton, Verrier Elwin, there are a few names who have studied and written about the tribals, and these perspectives one can see emerge from the colonial period. So what have we seen so far? That how the term tribal is, acquires different synonyms in different cultural contexts across the world. In India, different parts of the country, we see tribal that are inhabited by this social section. Then we also looked at that how the idea of the term Adivasis, which is also a lot of times used for them, which means the first settlers, brings in the idea of history. And we see from there we talked about that how tribal history then needs to be looked at in conjunction with the mainstream history. And over there we also need to think of the idea of an alternate history, which then is created by the recent tribal narratives or voices. And we saw that different texts then that have mentioned tribals, such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and of course among others. From there we move to the mention of the colonial period, how the term or what the term meant during that time, how the colonizers then engaged with the social section and conducted studies, etc. Right? From here we move to another point where we look at tribal history and literature. We see that many creative writers have used events from tribal history and they've fused them into their creative works, right? Now, of course, this is something which has been incredibly enabling. Why? Because the different movements, socio-political movements that have been spearheaded by, different people from the section of society then have inspired a lot of this creative writing. So what do we see? We see through these creative works, some kind of a representation being given to these historic events, if you can call it that. And now, while talking about these creative works, what comes to mind are the novels of Mahashweta Devi. Right? She wrote a lot of texts, and in quite a few of them, she engaged with the question of marginality, and particularly she also talks about the tribals and refers to actual events in history that involved the tribals, that involved some movements by them. Now, one such novel by her is titled In the Name of Birthday, which of course is a translation of the Bengali title. So one of her novels, which is titled In the Name of Birthday, which of course is a translation of the original title in an Indian language. Now, this novel In the Name of Birthday was published in actually Bangla, right? So the title was in Bangla, and In the Name of Birthday is an English translation of it. So it was published in Bangla in 1984, and it is based on a tribal or a Santhal revolt which took place in the Chota Nagpur region in the 18th century. Now, we see that how in this text Mahashweta Devi depicts how the Santhals then resisted invasion by the East India Company. So very clearly we see that Mahashweta Devi's engagement with this aspect of the tribal history, this event of the Santhal revolt in the 18th century that otherwise may not be very widely talked about in the mainstream history, which otherwise may not find space in the mainstream history. But Mahashweta Devi, refers to this event in the tribal history, and which then is of extreme importance. We also see another text by Mahashweta Devi, that is her novel Aranyar Adhikar, which was written in 1977, is also based on another event from history by the tribals, that is actually Birsa Munda's movement for tribal emancipation. So now Birsa Munda's movement forms the crux of Aranyar Adhikar, and we again notice what? We see that in Aranyar Adhikar, when she talks about Birsa Munda's movement for tribal emancipation, she's essentially giving space to the fact that how the tribals have had this kind of representation, or they've had this kind of a consciousness of the fact that they need to be emancipated from their current position. So of course there have been a lot of political engagement around uplifting those that have been on the margins. And when such events from history find expression in creative works, that makes a decisive impact on the mainstream discourse and the mainstream narratives, right? So we see that how many other creative works also, apart from Mahashweta Devi's novels, exist in the literary history, and that actually foreground tribal experience, bringing them into the mainstream. So we've noticed then how the term tribal acquired different connotations. In fact, not really connotations, but it acquired different meanings, or it acquired different synonyms and in different parts of the world. How the idea of history becomes a very, very important point of engagement when we look at the term tribal. The question of marginality becomes very crucial. The idea of history, mainstream versus the alternate, that also needs to be kept in mind when we understand the term. Right? Now we're of course going to further look at the question of history and the tribal narratives as we go on to our next lecture. Thank you.